I'm servicing the Poly 6, and I haven't done so for many years. If you saw my music video for digital analog, then you saw me doing pretty much the same thing then, many years ago, as I'm doing now. This synth has a very rich, complicated, and tragic story associated with it. And it all centers around Christmas. This is Christmas Day. Yesterday was the 41st anniversary of the Prophet 5 synthesizer coming into my life, which altered the lives of so many people. Obviously, most significantly my own, but almost as significantly many others who benefited from what happened as a result of that synth changing my life. Many lives were changed, including Massimo's, whose synth this Poly 6 was. He was in my high school synth band back in the early 80s. And after high school, we were music production partners, including on the biggest hit record that I had ever done, which led to the wonderful life that I'm living today. But the unfortunate reality is that this is not the happy ending that it provided for Massimo. And Christmas season for me is very bittersweet. Actually, it's pretty much non-existent now. It's a placeholder for me to remind me that in a couple of days, it'll be 9 years since Massimo killed himself. And, you know, these synthesizers that gave us both our lives became an obsession for him near the end. He had long sought after some truly incredible synthesizers, and he'd managed to obtain pretty much all of them. He had over 100 synthesizers by the end of his life. And that obsession kept him going for a while, many years actually. But it was an attempt to substitute an empty, I suppose you could call it a sugar rush for the psyche of seeking and acquiring items, objects, irrelevancies. And that last Christmas that pushed him over the edge involved for him a state of loneliness, desperate loneliness, even though more than anyone else I've ever known, he had the largest collection. Yes, I think that to him it was another collection of loving friends and family. But that Christmas in particular, he had become estranged from his immediate family, as in his wife and children, because he had not realized it. But his attitude had become overbearing and drove a wedge between himself and everyone, especially those closest to him. And he was so miserable around them, especially around them, that it became intolerable. He actually became violent. And it's a strange thing to consider that at that time, his view of himself, a constructed self, a constructed narrative that had been facilitated by anti-social media. For although it began long before his suicide, it began over a decade ago. And so that was, relatively speaking, the early days of this anti-social media madness. But it was no less powerful, perhaps even more so then, because it wasn't quite as pervasive as it is now. He had constructed a false version of himself, and he had told this story of who he imagined himself to be so much that he started to believe it, even in contradiction of his own behavior. As I said, even violently so with his own family. And when it got to that point where he was physically violent with his family, there came a day when he had no choice but to leave. And he could not connect the dots. He could not correlate who he was versus who he was trying to be. Not even to be. He wasn't trying to be. He was trying to present himself. And that's what happens with so many people on anti-social media. They become so obsessed with presenting themselves as some idealized version that they lose touch with reality and forget that that's not who they are. Although they start to actually believe it. And so his ultimate act of self-annihilation, it seems to me, as his closest friend for so many years, decades, that self-annihilation seemed to him, I think, the only clear choice, because he wanted so badly to be the generated, the created, the intended version of his unreal self, that his real self became an encumbrance. It became an obstacle. And so in that truly insane moment, he thought it was best to eliminate that inconvenient, real version of himself. And that final push came from the Christmas season, when he was so full of the lifetime of conditioning, 45 years of this is you at Christmas, And when he had lost that, even though it was by his own actions and his own choices and his own hand, he felt ashamed. And that shame and loneliness and despair and all these other emotions that are stirred up by an addiction to anti-social media resulted in that horrible act of violence perpetrated against himself. The ultimate act of violence against one's own self. But I think it was truly deliberate and well thought out, although the motivation was based on the antithesis of Zen, which has been I'm loath to use the word, but why not? It's been my savior during my life of utter solitude. I'm spending this Christmas just like every other one, alone. And I don't have a problem with that. Doesn't mean anything to me anyways. It's just another day. The planet is spinning just like every other day and orbiting around the sun just like every other day. And there's beauty to experience and behold. Expectations are irrelevant and counterproductive. And as Mo proved, harmful, especially to yourself. So if you, like me, are not participating in the conditioned behaviors of this particular non-special day, and you are alone at Christmas time, don't be depressed. Don't be sad. Don't feel alone. For you are not the only one. My love for humanity is not conditional. It does not depend on someone agreeing with me, even though I don't ask anyone to agree with me on anything. I'm not concerned with other people's opinions or views. Particularly if they result in some sort of potential negative behavior, negative energy directed at me, or anyone else for that matter. I love everyone equally, and I wish that everyone could transcend all of this competition and hostility and selfishness. Anyways, I'm going back to my Christmas tradition, my new Christmas tradition of working on Mo's synth. But that being said, as I said, in a few days, it will be the anniversary of his death. And although I did not get around to telling the story of this synth, perhaps some other day I will. But my plan is to have this synth working perfectly again in time for the 10th anniversary, at which time I will make a new song that will be the tribute to the Poly 6 and to Mo, where every sound will be made from this currently quite dead synthesizer. I think I have to recap it, replace all of the capacitors. Capacitors don't age well. But that's a story for another day. Merry Christmas. And I love you all, especially lonely people. Don't be lonely, please. Life is too beautiful.